It's really a pleasure to be back in Little Rock. The Olympics led me here in 1968. After I'd come back from the Olympics and I looked at the clean slate because there were no opportunities for women in college to compete, because I wasn't sure what my next steps were and I had to go back to school. I wanted to go back to school and I needed to put myself through school and make a living. I had written a letter after the Olympics in 1964 to the State Department saying that I had enjoyed the Olympics. I had met great Olympians, one in the cafeteria line named Wilma Rudolph, who won 3 gold medals, another one who wore his medal proudly around the Olympic Village. He was known as Cassius Clay then, Muhammad Ali. And that I'd had this extraordinary experience in the opening ceremonies of looking up at 5'2", weighing barely 100 pounds, looking up at this tall basketball player I didn't know, who without a word, and I didn't know him, picked me up and put me on his shoulder so I could see the torchbearer's entry into the Olympic Stadium. His name was Walt Bellamy. So I'd written this letter after the Olympics in '64 saying I wanted to give back, because in most sports in the United States, other than football, baseball, and basketball, still to this day, it's the volunteer that gets us to the victory stand. The parents that drive you to work out, the mother that gets up at 5:30 and puts the breakfast in the thermos bottle, so after a cold swim in an outdoor pool you have breakfast, that I wanted to give back. And that at this time in the 60s, when we were finally waking up to the fact that the world wasn't black and white and there was a lot of gray and we had to change how we lived in this country, that we ought to create a Peace Corps sport in America, that we needed to give back to our kids. Well, in 1968 in Little Rock, when I was invited down here, I had been invited to a program hosted by Vice President Humphrey. It was called Operation Champ. And there I re-met my friend Wilma Rudolph and Walt Bellamy. And we came to Little Rock at the time of the curfew. The cities were burning. People were organizing because we wanted change in America. I think somebody's trying to come in. So I came to Little Rock. I met with Rockefeller, and there's a curfew at 10 o'clock at night. And Wilma Rudolph decided she wanted to take me to one of the clubs in town. And I was living in the inner cities. And I came into this club as a white girl in a black world, and the music stopped. What was I doing there? And the people in the club realized that I was with the great Wilma Rudolph, first African-American woman to win 3 gold medals in the Olympics, born to a sharecropper's family, had polio, and ran her way to freedom. And all of a sudden I was accepted, the music started to play, and I realized that I was doing the right thing. It was a time when, after the Olympics of my world of winning and working hard and getting all the rewards, it was a time of great confusion. We were not only dealing with civil rights, we were dealing with feminism, we were dealing with the war in Vietnam, and I think of my kids now that are asking all these same questions, and I wonder how much we learn from history. So in '68, I came here, and I met the governor, then it was Winthrop Rockefeller, and I went on my way. And I decided that you don't give up. If you work together, there can be lots of change. '68 was a time of the Mexico Olympics. Right before those Olympic Games in '68, there was student unrest in Mexico, people forget. Many students were mowed down because of protests again, and the Games started under great controversy. Every time you went to an Olympic venue, you'd see the military standing in the wings with their machine guns. But those games were breakthrough. The power of television, the power of those that had the courage to report what was really going on. At that time, I worked with the giants in the business. Last night, my husband and I viewed a film that was given to me by a retiring producer at ABC Sports, because ABC Sports really created the way we watch television. And I was lucky enough at 17, after I wrote the letter to the State Department saying I wanted to work in inner cities, I was also had picked up the phone and said to ABC, I can't bear to leave the world of the Olympics, if you can let me talk about swimming and be part of your team, then I know that I can continue my love of sport while I get an education. So I grew up with people like Jim McKay, who, whenever we visited somewhere for an Olympic Games or for a sports story, he would always bring in the history. He always went beyond the field of play and brought you the whole story, put the event in the circumstances, told you about a new city. If we went to Prague, you learned about a revolution, about what happened there. If we went to Moscow, you learned about the Cold War. If you went to a mining town where they cut down trees, you learned about that culture too. So in 1968, we went to the Olympics amidst a cloud of violence, and lo and behold, it turned out to be one of the most incredible games of the modern Olympics, where in track and field, Bob Beamon leapt more than 25 feet, set a world record the last 25 years. It's interesting that I mentioned Bob Beamon because after I quit swimming and started working with Wilmer in Operation Champ under Vice President Humphrey, I met Bob Beamon. But I didn't know, after I gave a clinic to Bob and a bunch of kids, that years later, when I awarded him a medal, he would tell me and this group of people how he was inspired. And Bob Beamon, 2 years before the '68 Olympics, had been in the Last Chance School in New York City. He was a hopeless case, but they gave him one more chance. And a group of us, Ralph Boston, who'd held the world record in the long jump, John Thomas, who was a high jumper, Wilma Rudolph and I went into this inner city program and gave inspirational talks. Years later, Bob Beamon was given an award on Capitol Hill in the '80s for going beyond sport, which was a program we started in the Olympics about giving back. And Bob Beamon works in Dade County, gives back to kids to this day. And he got up and he said, I love the Spirit Award, but you know, I really owe it to the people that came to visit me in the '60s when I was a lost kid. And they talked about how you just focus, you put a coach behind you, you work with a team, and you never know what you can do. And that's when Bob Beamon turned his life around. And he took the Spirit Award and he handed it over to me. And he said, you came to the inner cities and you showed you cared with your team. This is for all of you. And he gave us the award. So what you're doing here in public service, you never know who you're going to touch. The day before yesterday, I went to the Clinton Library. President Clinton helped renew my faith in public service. I walked to that library and I think of all the places he touched. What a policy wonk he was. What a pleasure it was to meet Hillary and Bill and talk about issues, real issues. When I first met President Clinton, it was the first week when he and Hillary took office or moved into the White House. I had started, as Todd mentioned, the Women's Sports Foundation. I'd met Billie Jean King in 1974 after she beat Bobby Riggs. And I said, oh boy, you're a superstar. Let me bring the Olympic world to your world, and let's start a Women's Sports Foundation. Because in 1974, Title IX had just been passed in the Equal Education Amendments Act. Title IX basically said you cannot discriminate on the basis of sex or race in any federally funded institution. That meant if any institution received $1, you had to open the door to law school and medical school, and even on the field of play. When that act was passed in 1972, there was a legislator that thought if he added sports to it, it would defeat the bill. But lo and behold, by one vote, the bill passed, and that included sport. And there's still controversy about Title IX as it relates to athletics. But for the very first week of the president's taking office, we wrote to the president of the Women's Sports Foundation because we created a day where we go back to the Hill every year and we celebrate women in sport and educate members of Congress about the importance of opening the door not only to sport, elite sport, but to physical fitness. And over the years we've seen the connection between inactivity and obesity. We have morbid obesity issues in our country, big time, which relate to health issues. So the very first week, the President and the First Lady welcomed our group to the White House. And whereas I'd met other presidents, Reagan and Carter, Johnson, Ford, I started to talk in the line to the President about Title IX. And I said, you know, my sister helped with your campaign. He said, oh, Donna. You know how I'm sure if you've met the President, he never forgets your name. It's just an amazing thing. And I said, you know, we're here to make sure that we can get back to the enforcement of Title IX, because over these years it's gone back to the Supreme Court, and it had to be reintroduced, the Civil Rights Restoration Act. Under Reagan, Congress had to override his veto of Title IX and the Civil Rights Restoration Act. Congress has acted, but we need to get active about enforcement. And within those 8 years that I worked after that introduction with Clinton, the First Lady, Hillary, was always there to support Title IX. The President was always there to support Title IX. And additionally, they knew the nuances. They knew the guidelines. They knew the language. They were policy wonks, which makes you so comfortable when someone's leading the country that they really understand the legislation they're debating. And so subsequently to that, when the President named General McCaffrey to head up the drug enforcement, and there was an issue of drugs in sport on the Olympic arena, the President again weighed in, and I was appointed as an advisor to McCaffrey to get the international Olympic community and governments around the world to really get serious about getting performance-enhancing drugs out of sport. And that evolved into the World Anti-Doping Agency, which is a partnership between governments around the world and the International Olympic Committee, and an organization called the United States Anti-Doping Agency, which checks our athletes. Amidst all this, we always have to go back to Washington to retool legislation, to look at Title IX and how it applies to athletics and education, to look at our Olympic Committee and is it functioning well. Well, I don't know how many of you are sports nuts, but after Salt Lake City and we learned all about the bribery, again, the President weighed in, and a coalition of Democrats and Republicans refocused on our Olympic organization, went back and restructured our Olympic community in the mid-2000s. My journey through sport has taken me all around the world and introduced me to incredible people. Those of you that watched the Olympics in Beijing watched, yes, Michael Phelps win his 8th medal. What was significant about that, I felt, was that everyone wanted Michael Phelps to win that 8. It was like we were all part of history. And those athletes, in a way, inspire us. They make us believe that if we work hard and focus and try our hardest, that anything's possible. But what we don't see about the Olympic movement on television is how it connects all of us all over the world. There are 205 countries that participate in the Olympics now, more so than the past because many, for instance, the Soviet Union collapsed, and so Georgia now sends a team, and those countries that were part of that umbrella nation have split off and they send their own teams. But what goes on behind is year in and year out work, synergism between different sports organizations, different multi-sport competitions around the world. I just went to Bali for the beach games, where that country decided, hey, in this region, everybody hangs out at the beach. Let's have beach volleyball. Let's have beach soccer. Let's have beach softball. Let's create an environment where we can connect constantly. And what you don't see is the connection between the businesses that sponsor the Olympics. How can we not only get visibility through those that win in the games, but how can we, through solidarity programs, reach athletes in developing countries? There's over $25 million goes to countries in Asia to help develop programs. That amount goes into African countries, where they're developing programs, where they're helping facilitate athletic directors and coaches so that they can put teams on the field to play. Whereas the United States used to dominate all the sports, and we still do well because we have an incredible system that ties sport with education, which is unlike any other country. We're teaching those things to those other countries, and because we have, and because many athletes come here to train on scholarships, more countries won more medals than ever before at the Olympic Games, which is a good thing. Solidarity programs reach into regions all over the world. And one of my favorite stories that I did a documentary on last year in celebration of Title IX, because I wanted to take it out of this trench warfare between football and women's sports and the claim that Title IX has disseminated men's minor sports when it's really a resource issue. I decided to take an example of how Title IX has impacted the world and how one person who benefited has helped change the landscape of sport in the Middle East. In 1984, again with the ABC crew, that was their last Olympics in Los Angeles, to cover the games, I was given the opportunity at the last minute to cover swimming, synchronized swimming, co-host late night show with Jim Lampley. It's always a treat. He does a lot of boxing for HBO. And at the last minute, Rune Arledge, who we lost 4 or 5 years ago, the master of television and how he covers sports, asked me to cover track and field. And I was sitting at this little chair at the end of the oval track, and I watched this woman from Morocco qualify for the finals of the 400-meter hurdles. Now, the 400-meter hurdles had been added to the Olympic calendar right before the Games, as had the women's marathon. At those Games, there was still not women's softball or soccer. Those events would come later. And I thought to myself, there's a story here. How did this Moroccan, in a Muslim country predominantly, make it all the way to the Olympic arena? I thought, well, this is 1984. Possibly she was discovered by some coach somewhere in America and recruited to compete in the United States. So I went to my producers and I said, you know, we have to cover this story. This is an amazing story. Well, Edwin Moses was on his way to a string of victories that was incredible in the 400-meter hurdles. And these male-dominated macho producers, because there were very few that were open to women's sports, said, they just added this women's event. It really doesn't mean anything. And the Soviets have boycotted, and, you know, it's just not a significant event. And Edwin's the story. And I said, yes, Edwin's the story, but so is this woman. Well, they covered the race like, okay, this woman wins a race. So I said to myself, someday I'm going to tell the story of this woman. I'm going to find out the real story. 3 years later, I was given the opportunity to produce a show called Keepers of the Flame as a producer. And I said to my crew, I'm going to want to go find Nawal in Morocco, and I want to find out her story. So I got the okay. I went to Morocco, and I found out that Nawal El Moutawakil had been given a scholarship at Iowa State. She had gone to London for a competition after training with her father at night. She used to train at night because she was in a Muslim country, and she had a hard time running and training because at that time there weren't any women running and training, and Morocco was much more conservative. So if she ran at night, she wouldn't inspire the criticism of those around her. And her father was a policeman and used to say, Nawal, you run like the wind, someday you're going to do something great. And in order to do something great, you have to go to competitions outside Morocco. So she did, and there was a coach there. Title IX had been passed in '72, guidelines were released in '74, schools were supposedly had 3 years to come into compliance, and so coaches were out actively looking for athletes to recruit. So Nawal was given invitations for 3 or 4 different schools. She had no idea where Iowa State was. She had no idea what snow was or cold weather. But she decided that, yes, she'd take the leap of faith and she would come to the United States. She came to the United States and trained for a year and a half. She did not speak the language. She did not have warm clothes. That was difficult because when you're recruited and you go to an institution, you know the NCAA rules. You can't give out free clothing. She learned English with her track and field athletes, and her times kept coming down and down and down. In the middle of her training, her brother came to see her and stayed with her for 3 weeks. And she wondered why he was there, but she was happy. And when he left, he said, "I want to give you this picture." And he gave her a picture, and she turned it over, and it was a story. It was her father's picture. And she said, "Why are you giving me the picture?" And he said, "Well, Father's gone, and I didn't have the courage to tell you. He'd been killed in an automobile accident." And she said, "I got to come home." And he said, "No, I gave you this picture, and I came because he'd want you to continue to run." Well, she went to the 1984 Olympics. She qualified for the finals in the 400. And in that final race, something just lifted her above any competition. She almost broke the world record, and she won the gold medal. But that isn't the end of the story. I found it out when I went to Morocco. On that day she won the gold medal, the first African Muslim woman to ever win a gold medal. The King of Morocco said, on that day, every female child born should be named Nawal. I went back, those, 3 or 4 years later, and I put an ad in the paper. And I said, every child named Nawal should come meet the real Nawal on this time and this date. So I did my interview with Nawal. We went to the embassy, and there were these mothers veiled with their daughters, holding their hands, and the line was a round block to meet Nawal. Nawal, in my mind, transcended years of prejudice and tradition in one race. She was named by the king to his cabinet, one of the first women ever named to his cabinet. She served that. She finally found a great guy that could handle a star woman in that world. They married. She has 2 children. She is now Minister of Sport in Morocco. She has started a race. I went back this year to cover her again. And where you saw no women running in Morocco before she took her scholarship, now you see 40,000 women come to her race from all over the Middle East. She has now just been voted to the executive board of the International Olympic Committee, the only woman on the executive board, and she's making policy changes which have opened the door for women across the world. When I competed in the Olympics, only 11% of opportunities were open to women as athletes on the field of play. Now 45% are. Where women, weren't running anything longer than the 400 meters or running the marathon. They're playing, well, hopefully softball in 2016, that's another story. They're playing basketball, they're rowing, they're cycling, they're doing it all. We still have a ways to go. We're not making the decisions, we're not producing the television shows, there's a few of us. We're not calling the races. We take many steps forward and many steps back. But Nawal's a story of how one can touch another, how what we do here has an impact worldwide, how we can play it forward. I have stayed in the Olympic movement, not just to open the door for elite athletes, but to touch everyone, to bring 205 countries together for a world that's looking for a gathering place, a place where we can celebrate each other in peace. The Olympic Games shows that it's possible to do that. In this world where so much divides us, the Olympic Games have a way of uniting us. Yesterday, when I went into the Clinton Library, or the day before, and I saw the 1999 kiosk, there's a picture of the Women's World Cup victory above the line of everything else the president has done. I was chairman of that event, and it was wonderful to have the Clintons be honorary chairs. The president and the first lady came to the pivotal game between Germany and the U.S., where we were down 2-0 and we had to win. And the tournament might have collapsed at that time. World Cup, the women's soccer players went to the biggest stadiums in the country. And at this quarterfinal match, I said to, the president looked at me and so did Hillary and said, well, where do we go from here? It's halftime and the women are down 2-0. Well, in soccer, if you get to 3-0, it's like a death sentence. As a swimmer, I didn't really realize that. I just knew I was into this tournament and I wanted, this thing to be successful. And I said, our team usually comes back the second half. And I said, if they win, would you like to go to the locker room? And Hillary looked at me and said, if they lose, I still want to go to the locker room, which shows you exactly what they were about. And of course we won, and they both went to the locker room. And at that time I said to the president, because we were having trouble with China and the spy episode with the planes, I said, you ought to come to the final, because I think it's going to be between China and the U.S. And he came to the final. And the first locker room he went into was the Chinese locker room, and it was played all over China. So my title of my speech was The Olympics, a Force for Social Change. It's done one person at a time, one leader at a time. Synergism between athletes, administrators, coaches, and the leaders in our country. Also in that kiosk, I read a quote by the president that said, democracy was a great idea, an idea that we all have to embrace. The Olympic Games were a great idea, and there's problems with them. But I've stayed in that movement because of the connection, because of the possibility it shows, again, that we can all meet somewhere on this planet and do something great, that we can strive to be better, that our competition makes us better, and that we need to give those opportunities to many more of us. In our schools today, we need to put physical fitness back in our schools, the kind that's fun. We need to play more games. We need to make that connection between health and fitness. It isn't just about the elite athlete. You can use us to make a difference, but it's about taking care of our most important resource, our children. And I learned that at 13 when I went to the Olympic Games. I learned it when I was a Little League bat girl for my brother's team, because they organized girls right out of the game. All of us want to matter. All of us want to make an impact in this world. And I've been lucky enough to get into that game and stay into that game. So I commend you all here for wanting to give back, for being at the Clinton School. And what an inspiration it is to walk through that library and see what one person can do, what one couple can do, and how someone can inspire all of us. Thank you.
We do have time for some questions. If you raise your hand, Tisha, I'll get you a mic.
Hi, thank you so much for coming with us this morning. As a former college athlete, I'm very grateful for all of the work that you did with Title IX. Having the ability to grow up and compete in sports my whole life really affected the person who I am today.
Oh, thank you.
But my question is, with the growing rates of child obesity in this country, I know that a lot of money is being pumped into public schools to kind of tackle this issue. But as a former public school teacher, I also know that health is not a tested subject, and it's often easy to kind of get put by the wayside.
Yes.
And so how can we address this issue as part of a larger community, knowing that some of these things are not being addressed with our students in schools? How can we educate communities and parents about the importance of nutrition and healthy lifestyles?
Well, I'll tell you how we did it when Title IX was under attack under the Reagan administration, when a challenge went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court came back and said to Congress, you've got to redefine your guidelines, because Title IX should only apply to the program that receives federal funding, not the school. So that would have wiped us out. So we took our star athletes to Washington. We gave them information. We do this every year, actually. I have a big fundraiser in New York where we bring in star athletes and fill a room and raise $1 million in one night now. It didn't start in the beginning. And that helps funds advocacy, or we call it education because we don't lobby per se. And, your representatives are there to represent you. And there's power in numbers and power in programs. And you have to challenge your leadership. And you have to use all your change agents and all your leaders to go in. So we were able to go back to Washington and get the Civil Rights Restoration Act passed. Now, that was broader than just Title IX as it applies to athletics. It was Title IX as it applies to every program in school and for those with disabilities. So we had just masses of numbers on the Hill pushing for this and discussing the connection, because we've done research. When we started the Women's Sports Foundation, yes, in the 60s, people began to realize that civil rights was the right way to go. So we got a lot of mileage about, hey, men get, you know, when we started with Title IX, 1 in 27 girls played sports, now 1 in 3 do. So we could say 1 in 27 girls play sports, but we need to appeal emotionally. But now you have to go in with studies. So we have studies. If you go on our website, womensportsfoundation.com, there are all these research papers that show the relationship between activity and obesity. And you have to take all that together, put a program together, get the numbers, and lobby. Those people are, you know, your legislators are supposed to be doing that. And then you have to appeal to the unions. One of the difficulties is if you want to do physical fitness after school and have kids who are latchkey kids stay on campus, one of the issues is that the unions don't want to open up and spend the extra time. So there comes in the extra money. Or the insurance companies have to be dealt with. They don't want to cover the costs of after-school hours. And those are issues that have been there for 30 years. But with the country the way it is right now, with all the issues we have, I think now's the time to mobilize and come up with specific programs and enlist your leadership.
Anybody else?
Any more questions?
Good morning.
Morning.
What went through your mind in 1968 as you were covering it when John Carlos and Tommy Smith made the statement they did?
I was on their side. I had lived in inner cities. In '66, actually, I started in this Vice President Humphrey program. I had been friends with Wilma Rudolph and Willie White, who we lost 2 years ago. She was on 5 Olympic teams. And I would tour with them. And in the South, because of the color, my friends had to walk into the back of the hotel to get in to compete. And I said, you know, this is a peaceful demonstration. Some would argue that that kind of demonstration is what caused what happened with the torch relay around the world. That one got out of hand. I think sympathy went back to the Olympic movement. If it had been peaceful, I think it would have been a different case. But it was interesting because ABC at the time, the producer on the field, would not put his camera on it because he felt you shouldn't support a demonstration on a peaceful field of play. Those of us that were my age supported it, and so did Howard Cosell. The U.S. Olympic Committee banned the athletes and kicked them out of the Olympic Village, and they came to stay at the ABC Hotel. You fast forward to these Olympics after the torch relay, and athletes were told specifically, if you do any demonstrations, you do them, but there'll be consequences. And there were consequences for the athletes. They came back, they didn't get, they didn't get sponsorship, a lot of things. So there was a price to be paid. But I think it was an important statement at the time.
Gosh.
Yes.
Thank you so much for coming this morning. As a member of a club team in college, I was wondering, do you think that cheerleading and football is a successful fulfillment of Title IX because they told us that we're the only thing that's going to hold us back from becoming NCAA is Title IX? And you said in your speech, it was lack of resources mainly, but we were told that it's going to be because of Title IX.
Yeah, that's the kicker. So because we want to honor civil rights and the opportunity for everyone, male or female, to reach his or her potential, we're going to say that we really shouldn't have equality, that an elite group of athletes should have the advantages mainly because of big business. It's so frustrating when Title IX is blamed. Title IX is about opening up opportunities equally It's part of our legacy from the 60s. When you get into the sports issue, it's about big business and resource allocation. There are many schools in the South that have 130 football players on the bench. Professional football teams have 50-some. I was on the Bush, believe it or not, I got on a Bush commission. It was called Opportunity in Athletics Commission. And because of this issue, which is always, unfortunately, it's always spun that it's Title IX, that you don't get your opportunities. I said when I was asked to join the commission, I want Julie Foudy on the commission with me, who is the captain of the women's soccer team, and I want to address opportunity in athletics in America. I don't want to get into a battle about Title IX. We ought to open up the box. There's boxes in sports. There's the NCAA box, there's the Olympic box, there's the Y box, there's the boys club box, there's the girl club box. We have the best training facilities in the world. We have fields of play, we have parks, we all have to work together, we have to open up the dialogue. I was told we were going to do that. In the end, it was all about Title IX, about changing how we apply Title IX to athletics. That's how we got squeezed back into the box. So, as a commissioner, there were 2 independent athletes on this commission with the majority Division I athletic directors. And I looked at the Division I athletic directors and I said, if we change Title IX, and how it applies to athletics, would you put men's gymnastics back? Would you put men's swimming back? And they looked at me and they said, no way, because we are in a competitive race with each other. If Tennessee has 130 football players on the bench, I have to have 130 players on the bench, because we're going for the big money. If one school pays a coach $1 million, I have to take that $1 million out of somewhere, and I'm going to take it out of men's and women's minor sports if I can get away with it. And I'm going to pay that so I can compete. We are headed for a train wreck in Division I sports because of this competition. These are not my words. These are the Division I athletic directors' words. But it's easier to blame Title IX than talk about sharing the pie. And it's very frustrating because there's not a woman athlete in this country that wants a men's sport cut. And I can make the argument that without Title IX, we might not have any minor sports in schools. We'd have football, baseball, and basketball. So, and in most schools, the argument is, well, football pays for everything. Well, in 95% of the schools, it doesn't. The student body pays for it because it's so expensive to run a football program. My father was an All-American football player. I grew up going to Cal Berkeley games. I love football. My brother played football, and I just think it's an unfair argument. But how can you blame someone in an athletic department? They're not going to go take on the football coach or the athletic director, especially in this part of the world, because those guys are tied into the senators, the governors. This is weekend fun. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to blame it on Title IX, because I'm not going to take on the big guys, and that's really the truth. So. And it's not my quote, it's a Division I athletic director's quote.
Anyone else? Well, let's thank Donna de Varona for that presentation.
Thank you, everybody.